Rabbi Sobel, welcome to Crosswalk Talk. Thanks for joining me.
Shalom, it's great to be with you again.
We are talking to Rabbi Jason Sobel. He's the author of several books that have really made a major impact on Christianity and Judaism around the world, including Signs and Secrets of the Messiah and Mysteries of the Messiah. He's also an advisor to The Chosen. Everybody knows about that, of course. He's also host of the new TBN series, Signs and Secrets of the Messiah, based, of course, on the book that you have there right behind you. um, Rabbi Sobel, I've spoken with you several times. I always enjoy talking to you. I'm curious. Growing up, did you even know what a Messianic Jew was? Did you even know what a Jewish follower of Jesus was?
I had absolutely no clue. I
Okay.
mean, I grew up in the Holy Land, New Jersey, where there were more Jews than in Jerusalem. And I pretty much knew Jews and Catholics growing up. And I thought Jesus was a great man, teacher, prophet, but didn't know much.
Okay. And so you didn't know much. At what point did you then learn of this meshing of these two faiths?
Yeah, I mean, what happened is I was working in a large recording studio in New York City, working with a lot of famous people. And as I was surrounded by these rock stars and rappers, I looked at their life and I said, there has to be something more than this. And I
Mm.
began a spiritual journey. I was going to the synagogue and studying with my traditional rabbi. And I started studying martial arts and Eastern philosophy. And one day I was meditating and I had this crazy spiritual experience. My soul began to leave my body. Next thing I knew, I was up in heaven and I was standing before this king who was Ram Vinisa, high and lifted up. In this glorious light, felt the power of God pulsate through every part of my body. And I didn't know anything, but I knew that that was Jesus, his Hebrew name, Yeshua, seated there on that throne. And he told me I was called to serve him. Next thing I know is back in my body, shaking under the power of heaven, running around going, I'm called to serve him. My mom's like, you're called to serve who? We're Jewish, for goodness sake. But my best friend who was came to faith and started to share with me, he said, Jason, could you tell the difference between the Old and the New Testament? I said, sure. He said, let me read you this passage. He was bruised for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities, by his stripes we're healed. He said, is that the Old or the New? I said, it's obviously talking about Jesus. It must be the New Testament. He said, no, that's Isaiah 53, the Jewish prophet, speaking 700 years before he walked the face of the earth. He
Mm.
invited me to this Messianic congregation where Jewish people worship Jesus in a Jewish way. I went. At the end of the service, they played the piano and prayed. I figured I needed all the help I can get, so I prayed. They said, if you prayed this prayer for the first time, raise your hand. So I raised a hand. They said, if you raise this hand, will you please stand up? You've just been born again. I had no idea what that meant. I gave my mother enough trouble when I was born once. God only knows what would happen if I was born again. I thought I was safe. No one was supposed to be looking. But the Messianic rabbi said, I saw you raise your hand. If you can't stand here for the Messiah, you won't be able to stand for him in the world. I realized we weren't going anywhere till I stood up. I stood up. The rabbi who led me to faith was Rabbi Jonathan Kahn. Maybe you're familiar with him. Gave me the first New Testament I've ever seen, took it home, read it, and realized he was the one who Moses and the prophets spoke of.
How are Messianic Jews viewed within the larger Jewish community, the larger Judaism?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, it depends by who. By the religious Jewish community, like the Orthodox Jewish community, not very favorably, though they don't look on anyone who's not Orthodox usually very favorably. Uh, Historically, things have changed in the mainstream Jewish community since the Jewish community has become so much more secular. It's become much more open. And so, if you're a Jewish person who embraces your Jewish identity and seeks to integrate that with your faith in Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus, there's a greater openness now more than ever, but it depends upon the individual and usually how religious they are or not.
This is a question that might, help you talk about your books, which we're going to talk
Yeah.
about in a minute anyway. But I'm just curious, how do you integrate Jewish traditions within your faith? That's probably the big question people ask you when they uh, are allowed to ask questions like this. Well, how do you integrate
Yeah, I
your
think it's a
your
I think
traditions?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Look, we have to remember every major event in the life of Jesus happened on a biblical holiday. He died as the Passover lamb. He rose from the dead on the biblical holiday of first fruits. He poured out his spirit, Acts chapter 2. We know it as Pentecost, but Pentecost is really just the Greek translation for the Hebrew biblical holiday, Shavuot, the day that God gives the Torah, the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. And so he celebrated these holidays with his disciples, John 7, Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacles, John 10, Hanukkah. So we're doing what Jesus did, right? Remember those braces, what would Jesus do? Well, we're doing what he did with his disciples because all of the biblical holidays point to him. So the biblical holidays are a big thing. The Shabbat and Shabbat dinners, reading the Bible and New Testament in Hebrew, praying some of the traditional Jewish prayers, putting on the prayer shawl. So these are just some of the ways that we try and integrate, just like the first followers of Jesus did.
What day of the week do you worship?
Well, we always do Friday night Shabbat dinner with the family,
Mhm.
which is always something very special. So rest on the Shabbat, worship on the Shabbat, but often I'll worship with my brothers and sisters on Sunday as well. So we
Mhm.
combine both as we can.
Just curious. I've always wanted to ask you that, and now I know the answer.
There you go.
You wrote a book, Signs and Secrets of the Messiah, and you have a new television series of the same name. It's
Yeah,
the blue book behind you on the video here.
yeah.
What led you to write that, and what can folks learn about Jesus and their faith in that book?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think one, we live in a time in the world with all the craziness that's going on. I think there's a lot of hopelessness and discouragement. I think people look at the world and they're like, is it ever going to get better? Can anything really change? It just seems like every day there's more bad news. And I think the point of the miracles is that, you know what? It declares that number one, that there's hope, that we're not bound by just natural. We serve a God who is supernatural, and no matter how difficult our situation and circumstances, God can intervene and do something for us because he is the same yesterday, today, and forever, which is, I think, so important, understanding that reality. And then I think also we need to understand that the signs are meant to be a signpost. It's kind of like a billboard when you go down the street. The billboard doesn't exist for itself. The billboard is trying to communicate a message. And the miracles are trying to communicate a message. It's trying to teach us more about the identity and the person of Jesus. And they're tremendous testimony to who he is and his promises, as well as his power for our life. And I think that's important for everyone. But also, Paul makes it very clear, the apostle and Rabbi Paul, that Jewish people seek a sign, right? Meaning that Greeks seek wisdom, Jews seek a sign, Paul says. And I think that by understanding the miracles, it's really a powerful tool as well for sharing our faith. And one of the things we do in this book is part of our passion and everything that we do is that we want people to see the Bible in high definition. And
Mm.
so there's so many little details that are in the Bible that bring it to life in ways that are just kind of outstanding. I think a lot of times people get bored with the Bible. They're like, well, we've heard everything about this before. But you know what? If you haven't seen it from its original context, like the disciples would have heard it
Mm.
and seen it, then we're not getting the full story. We're settling for half an inheritance. For example, the first miracle that we discuss in the TV series and in the book is Jesus' first miracle, the turning the water into wine. Well, why is that the first miracle that he did? Of all the miracles, why is that the first one? Well, think about it for a moment. What's the first miracle Moses did? Moses turned the water into blood.
Mm,
Jesus is the greater than Moses. Deuteronomy 18:18, I will raise up a
mm.
prophet like you. But Jesus doesn't come to bring death, he comes to bring life. So he doesn't turn the water into blood, he turns the water into wine, which is a symbol of the messianic kingdom all throughout the Old Testament, all throughout Jewish tradition, as well as a symbol of joy, that when we experience kingdom life, the joy that he offers us, it's a picture of taking something ordinary water and transforming it into something extraordinary wine. And that's something that he does with each and every one of us.
And this is an 8-part series on TBN.
Yeah.
I know
Eight, eight.
folks can
I'm
watch
sorry.
it on demand and on
Yeah, yeah, an
yeah.
eight-part series where we go through a number of the different miracles and we dive deep. It's filmed in Israel. So like when we talk about the miracle of Cana at Galilee, we're actually walking through the streets of Cana. We're actually at the church
Mm,
where it's believed traditionally that the miracle happened, with the 6 stone pots. Why 6 stone pots? All God is in the details. If there's a detail in the Bible, it's there for a reason. We shouldn't just overlook it. God doesn't waste words. Well, think about it. Man was created on the 6th day. So 6 is a number of man. And Jewish thought we fell on the 6th day. And so when Messiah comes, he does the first miracle on the 6th day,
mm.
water into wine, because he's actually restoring the fruitfulness and the blessing that we lost when we ate of the tree in the garden. Now he's performing a miracle with a fruit of the tree. Fill the pots to the brim. Don't live out of the lack. I want you to live out of the overflow of what I had for you. And when Jesus dies, he dies on Friday, which is the 6th day of the week, the same day man was created, the same day man fell in Jewish thought. He dies on the cross on the 6th day. He's a second Adam. Even the reason why he dies on a cross on the 6th day, why? Man took from the tree. The cross is a tree. God literally puts Jesus back on the tree for you and me to undo the sin of the first man and woman.
Transitioning here, of course, you are an advisor to the Chosen, and I've always been curious. How did you get involved in that? Because for those who don't know, you can watch yourself, Dallas Jenkins, a Catholic priest and a Protestant, I think, professor at a university or seminary. I'm not
Yeah,
sure. I don't know their
yeah,
names, but
yeah,
it's a roundtable discussion,
yeah.
and you guys discuss the scripts and the shows. But before all that, you guys are giving advice on the scripts before the shows are even made. I'm just curious, how did you get that position?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when The Chosen was a concept, before it even had a name, uh, a friend of mine who was helping Dallas, who really helped Dallas launch it, connected us because Dallas, from the very inception, they wanted to make sure that it was different from the other Jesus media that was out there. And they really wanted it to have that Jewish flair, the Jewish roots to it, and make it really historically, biblically accurate. So I connected with Dallas, and before the first episode was filmed, I took him and some others to Israel because they had never been to Israel. We went to many of the locations where season 1 was going to be filmed. We filmed a number of teachings from Israel, some of which went viral. And
Mm.
I was the first spiritual advisor on it and have been a part of
Wow.
it ever since. So that means reading the scripts and giving input, taking, calls from Dallas or others when they have questions. Jonathan Rumi, who plays Jesus, is a friend of mine. He's come and celebrated many holidays with us. It was funny. One
Mm.
time he was at our house celebrating Passover, and my son turns to me and says, "Dad, it's really weird. Jesus is sitting at the table and you're leading the Passover." But but for example, this season is a season, season 5 that they're filming the Passover,
Yeah.
the Last Supper. And so I actually went to Dallas, went on the set, sat with all the disciples in Dallas and walked them through a Passover and answered questions, and involved in the Chosen Con events. And we actually have a spin-off series called The Chosen Unveiled on TBN, where we go through the different
Mm.
episodes of The Chosen as well.
Continuing this rapid fire series of questions, this might be my last one. I've always um, been curious your position on the two-state solution in Israel, because that's a hot topic right now following the terrorist attack last October. Uh, people in DC and around the world are trying to figure out how do we end this mess. And a lot of people want a two-state solution where the Palestinians would get a state there in that land. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think historically, the majority of Israelis are for a two-state solution. I think the real challenge, as we've seen, is how can a Palestinian state or entity be created that's not radicalized? Because I feel kind of what has happened is that some of these radical groups, like Hamas, try to hijack the Palestinian cause for independence and self-determination, not really in the best interest of the Palestinians, but really out of an extremist ideology and being funded and subservient to the Iranians who have their own agenda and who are trying to destabilize the region. And so that is the real question in all of this. How does Israel secure its safety and create an entity for the Palestinians? And I think that is the challenge. The challenge is there has to be leaders who are not radicalized, and there needs to be someone to really make peace with. And that's been a challenge because, as we've seen, okay, people don't know, there's been a real division among the Palestinians. Gaza has been ruled by Hezbollah,
Yeah.
and the West Bank is ruled by the Palestinian Authority. Well, who's in control of this new Palestinian state? Or is it two Palestinian states? Or so even amongst themselves, the question is, who are you dealing with? And that has been the real challenge, because for years the Palestinian Authority was kicked out by Hamas in Gaza, and that's why what we see. So there's a lot of challenges there with it, but I think in general, if there was a way to create a Palestinian state that could ensure the security of Israel, I think many Israelis are for it. But the real question is, can that actually occur?
Yeah.
Are there real partners for peace in the process? And that's really the challenge and the question that needs to be asked. But I just think something that people need to understand too is that is often this accusation that Israel is an apartheid state, and that, like South Africa was. But the reality is there's over 2 million Palestinian or Arabs living in Israel, and they have full rights. They sit once on the Supreme Court, they sit in government, they're represented in the Knesset. And so again, Israel doesn't want to suppress or persecute or commit genocide against the Palestinian people. If they did, they would start at home, and they haven't, right? And many Palestinians don't want to be under the authority of the Palestinian Authority, because they understand that it's very restrictive and oftentimes repressive. And unfortunately, that's especially true of Christians. Christians are greatly persecuted. If we take people to Israel and we go to Bethlehem, we always go to the Christian gift shops, because they're literally struggling to survive and feed their family. There is a systematic economic oppression and persecution against Christian in Bethlehem, and it's dwindling. And so again, Christians are much better in Israel than they are unfortunately, under the Palestinian government.
And a lot of people who are pushing for this nowadays don't even realize, or maybe forgotten, that this was tried under President Clinton 20 years ago. And that's probably as close as we've come. And it was, I believe, rejected by the Palestinian leader at the time, if I remember that correctly.
Yes, Yasser Arafat. They were offered 95% of everything they asked for.
Yeah,
and walked away.
Yeah,
and they walked away. I mean, there were two major issues. One is Israel is not going to divide Jerusalem. The holy sites in Jerusalem are never going to be taken out of Jewish control, and that would be the worst idea possible, because again, we see what happens to Christians under Palestinian Authority, and the ability for Christians and Jews to be able to go to these holy sites would be greatly diminished. And the security nightmare is just not tenable. So there are a number of reasons, but they were minor.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, you got to have people who are willing, part of the deal is there's concessions on all sides.
Yeah. 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 You got to have somebody on the other side that at least acknowledges a right to exist.
Yeah.
And I think that's the big missing piece right now. Rabbi Sobel, it's always good talking to you. Thank you so much,
Thank you
sir.
so much. Great being with you. God bless.